The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the small adobe homestead near Tucson, Arizona territory, and 22-year-old Sarah Mitchell felt every ounce of its brutal strength as she pushed the stone mono across the matat, grinding dried corn kernels into meal with movements that had become increasingly labored over the past 3 hours. Her father had died 6 months ago from pneumonia, leaving her alone on this patch of scrubland they had claimed 4 years earlier in 1879. And now in the summer of 1883, Sarah found herself struggling to maintain the routines that survival demanded. The corn had to be ground, the chickens had to be fed, the small vegetable garden had to be watered from the well before the afternoon heat turned everything to dust. There was no one else to do these things, no neighbors close enough to call upon regularly, just Sarah and the endless work that frontier life required. Her arms trembled as she pushed the grinding stone forward again, her muscles screaming in protest. She had been at this since dawn, and the pile of cornmeal in the clay bowl beside her seemed pitifully small compared to the mound of whole kernels still waiting. Sweat dripped down her face, stinging her eyes, and her dark blonde hair, tied back with a faded blue ribbon, clung damply to her neck. The sleeves of her worn cotton dress were rolled up past her elbows, exposing sun-browned forearms that shook with exhaustion. She gritted her teeth and pushed the stone forward again, but this time her grip faltered. The mono slipped from her weakened hands and clattered against the matat with a sharp crack that made her flinch. Sarah stared down at her trembling fingers, barely able to make a fist, and felt the hot sting of tears behind her eyelids. She would not cry. Crying accomplished nothing. Her father had taught her that strength was a choice, not a feeling, but her body was making its own choices now, and strength seemed to be in short supply. The sound of hoofbeats approaching made her look up sharply, one hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that leaned against the adobe wall near the door. Visitors were rare out here, and not all visitors came with good intentions. She squinted against the bright sunlight, watching as a lone rider emerged from the heat shimmer on the dusty trail that passed for a road. The man rode a sturdy chestnut horse and sat his saddle with the easy confidence of someone who had spent more time on horseback than on foot. As he drew closer, Sarah could make out more details. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, dusty denim trousers, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a weather-beaten hat that had seen better days, and a bandana tied loosely around his neck. A gun belt sat low on his hips, but his hands rested calmly on his saddle horn, making no move toward the weapon. He reined his horse to a stop a respectful distance from her homestead and tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the quiet morning air. "I don't mean to intrude. I'm looking for the road to the Miller Ranch. I think I might have taken a wrong turn a few miles back." Sarah stood slowly, her legs stiff from kneeling, and kept her hand near the rifle without actually touching it. "The Miller Ranch is about 8 miles southeast of here," she said, her voice hoarse from lack of use. She did not speak much these days, with no one to speak to. "You will want to head back the way you came until you reach the fork near the old cottonwood. Take the left branch." The cowboy nodded his thanks, but his eyes had moved past her to the grinding stones and the scattered corn, and then back to her face with an expression that might have been concern. "Much obliged, ma'am." He hesitated, then asked, "Everything all right out here? That is a lot of corn to grind alone." "I manage," Sarah said shortly, not wanting charity or pity from a stranger. He studied her for a moment longer, and she found herself noticing, despite herself, that he had kind eyes, a warm brown color like honey held up to sunlight, and a face that suggested he was somewhere in his middle 20s. A few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, and dust from the trail coated his clothes and hat. He looked tired but not unkind. "I can see that you do," he said finally, "but managing and thriving are two different things if you do not mind me saying so." Before she could formulate a sharp response to that, he swung down from his horse with fluid grace. "Name is James Thornton. I have been riding since before sunrise, and my horse could use some water if you have any to spare. I would be happy to pay for the trouble." Sarah's ingrained sense of frontier hospitality warred with her desire to be left alone. Hospitality won, as it usually did. "There is a trough by the side of the house," she said, gesturing. "No payment necessary. Water is free to those who ask." James Thornton led his horse to the trough, letting the animal drink its fill while he stretched his back and looked around the homestead with an assessing eye that Sarah found slightly irritating. What was he looking for? Signs of weakness? Evidence that she could not handle this life alone? When his horse had drunk enough, James walked back toward where Sarah had returned to her grinding stones. She had picked up the mano again, determined to prove that she was perfectly capable, but her hands were still shaking and she could not seem to get a firm grip. "How long have you been at that?" James asked, crouching down beside her with easy informality. "A while," Sarah admitted grudgingly. "Your arms are shaking." "I am aware of that, thank you." James was quiet for a moment, watching her struggle to push the stone across the matat with anything resembling effectiveness. Then he said, "My mama used to grind corn for hours when I was a boy. She taught me how when I was about 10 years old. Said any man worth his salt should know how to prepare his own food and not expect women to do all the work." Sarah glanced at him sideways, not sure whether to believe this. "Most men I have known would rather starve than grind corn." "Most men I have known are fools," James said mildly. He held out his hand. "Let me spell you for a bit. You rest." "I do not need rest. I need to get this corn ground before the afternoon heat makes it impossible to work." "And you will get it done faster if you let your arms recover for 10 minutes, James pointed out, with infuriating logic. "Besides, I am heading to the Miller Ranch to sign on as a hand, but I do not need to be there until tomorrow. I have got time." Sarah wanted to refuse. She wanted to tell this stranger to mind his own business and leave her to her work. But her arms were trembling so badly now that she could barely hold the grinding stone, and pride seemed like a foolish luxury when there was so much corn left to grind and so many other tasks waiting after that. 10 minutes, she said finally, releasing the mano and sitting back on her heels. James took her place at the metate with a nod of thanks, as if she had done him a favor rather than the other way around. He picked up the grinding stone and began to work with smooth, practiced motions that spoke of genuine experience. The rhythmic scraping sound filled the morning air, and Sarah watched in surprise as the pile of cornmeal began to grow at a much faster rate than she had managed. "Your mama really taught you that?" she asked after a few minutes. "She did," James confirmed, not breaking his rhythm. "My pa died when I was 8, cattle stampede. After that, it was just Mom and me and my little sister on a small ranch in Texas. Mama said we all had to pull our weight, and that meant learning to do whatever needed doing, whether it was typically men's work or women's work." He paused to push more corn kernels onto the matite. "She was a remarkable woman. Taught me most of what I know about surviving in this country." "Was?" Sarah caught the past tense. "She passed 2 years ago. Fever." James's hands never stopped moving, but something in his voice softened. "My sister married a store clerk in San Antonio and moved to the city. I drifted for a while, worked different ranches, ended up here in the Arizona territory." "I am sorry about your mother," Sarah said quietly. "Thank you. I am sorry if I am prying, but are you out here alone?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "My father died last winter. Pneumonia." James glanced at her, and she saw understanding in his eyes rather than pity. "That is a hard thing. You have been managing this place by yourself since then?" "There is no one else to manage it." "No other family? No brothers or sisters?" "My mother died when I was born. I was an only child." Sarah found herself talking more than she had in months, the words spilling out easier than she expected. "My father and I came west from Missouri in 1879. He wanted land of his own, a fresh start. We filed a claim on this section and built the house together." James nodded, still grinding steadily. "It is a good solid house. Adobe keeps cool in summer, warm in winter. Your father knew what he was doing." He was a good man, Sarah said, and her voice caught slightly on the words. He deserved more years than he got. They fell into a companionable silence broken only by the scraping of stone on stone and the occasional clucking of chickens from their small coop behind the house. Sarah felt her arms beginning to recover, the trembling subsiding as the muscles relaxed. She watched James work and found herself appreciating not just his help, but his quiet, unassuming manner. He had not barged in and taken over with condescending assurance that he knew better. He had simply offered help and accepted her conditions. After about 15 minutes, James sat back and surveyed his work. The pile of cornmeal had grown substantially, and he had made good progress through the remaining whole kernels. "Your turn again if you're ready," he said, "or I can keep going if your arms are still tired." Sarah flexed her hands experimentally. They still ached, but the violent trembling had stopped. "I can take over," she said. But as she reached for the grinding stone, James shook his head. "Tell you what," he said, "why do not I just finish this lot? It will not take more than another half hour, and like I said, I have got nowhere I need to be until tomorrow." "I cannot ask you to do that." "You are not asking, I am offering." James picked up the menu again. "Besides, it has been a while since I ground corn, and my mama would rise from her grave and haunt me if I got out of practice." Despite herself, Sarah felt a small smile tug at her lips. "Well, we certainly cannot have that." "Exactly." James grinned at her, and the expression transformed his dusty, trail-worn face into something genuinely handsome. "Though I would take it as a kindness if you had some water I could drink. This is thirsty work." Sarah got to her feet, grateful for the excuse to move and do something useful. "I will get you some. And I should probably offer you a meal if you're going to be working through the lunch hour." "I would not say no to a meal if it is not too much trouble." "It is not trouble. You are doing me a significant service. It is the least I can offer." Sarah went into the house, relishing the relative coolness of the thick adobe walls. The interior was simple but tidy. One main room that served as kitchen and living space, with a small bedroom partitioned off in the back. A cast-iron stove stood against one wall. A rough wooden table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, and shelves held their modest collection of dishes, food supplies, and a few precious books that her father had insisted on bringing from Missouri. She dipped water from the bucket near the door and poured it into 2 tin cups, then carried them back outside. James accepted his with grateful thanks and drank deeply before returning to his work. Sarah sipped her own water more slowly, watching him and trying to remember the last time someone had helped her with anything. The neighboring homesteaders, the Johnsons, had checked on her a few times in the first month after her father's death, but they lived nearly 10 miles away and had their own struggles to contend with. The nearest town, Tucson, was a hard day's ride, too far to visit with any regularity. Sarah had become accustomed to solitude and self-reliance to the point where accepting help from this stranger felt strange and uncomfortable, like wearing boots that did not quite fit. But she could not deny that it also felt like a tremendous relief. James worked steadily through the remaining corn, his movements efficient and sure. Sarah went back inside and began to prepare a simple meal of beans, bacon, and the last of her bread. It was plain fare, but it was what she had, and it would be filling. She worked at the stove, stirring the beans and slicing the bacon, and found her thoughts drifting to the man outside. What was his story, really? He had told her about his mother and sister, but what had brought him to the Arizona territory? What was he hoping to find here? And why had he been so willing to stop and help a stranger when he could have simply gotten his directions and ridden on? When she carried the food outside on 2 tin plates, James had just finished grinding the last of the corn. He sat back with a satisfied sigh and wiped sweat from his forehead with his bandana. "There now," he said. "That is done. You have got enough cornmeal to last you a good while." "Thank you," Sarah said, and she meant it deeply. "Truly. I do not know how long it would have taken me to finish that on my own." "Probably the rest of the day, judging by how much you had left." James accepted the plate she handed him and looked at it with evident appreciation. This looks wonderful, ma'am, much better than the hardtack I've been eating on the trail. Please call me Sarah. If you're going to grind my corn and eat at my table, we can dispense with formalities. Sarah, then, and I am James. He dug into the food with good appetite, and Sarah sat down on an upturned crate nearby with her own plate. They ate in silence for a few minutes, and then James said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask. I may not answer." He smiled at that. "Fair enough. What are you planning to do out here long term? I do not mean to be rude, but this is hard country for anyone, let alone someone working alone." Sarah had been asking herself the same question for 6 months and still did not have a good answer. "I honestly do not know," she admitted. "This land is all I have. My father and I put everything we had into this claim. If I leave, I lose it all. But staying—" She trailed off, not wanting to voice her fears about whether she could actually survive alone. "Staying is hard work," James finished for her. "Yes?" James chewed thoughtfully on a piece of bacon, his eyes distant. "Have you thought about hiring help? Someone to work the land with you, share the burden?" "With what money?" Sarah asked with a bitter laugh. "I can barely feed myself, let alone pay wages." "There are other arrangements, sharecropping, for instance, or you could offer room and board in exchange for labor." Sarah had considered this actually, but the thought of having a stranger living on her property, depending on her hospitality, had seemed overwhelming. "Maybe," she said noncommittally. James nodded and did not push the subject. They finished their meal, and then James stood and stretched. "I should probably be moving on," he said, though he sounded reluctant. "Thank you for the food and the water, and for letting me help with the corn. It felt good to do something useful." "You are welcome here any time," Sarah said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. "If you are ever passing this way again." "I will remember that." James walked to his horse and swung into the saddle, and then paused and looked back at her. "Sarah, I know we just met, and I've got no right to offer advice. But you should not be out here alone. This country is too hard, too dangerous. At least think about what I said about hiring help, or maybe staying with those neighbors you mentioned until you can figure out a better arrangement." "I will think about it," Sarah said, knowing she probably would not. James tipped his hat to her. "Take care of yourself, Sarah Mitchell." "Safe travels, James Thornton." She watched him ride away, following her directions toward the Miller Ranch, until he disappeared into the heat shimmer. Then she turned and looked at the generous pile of freshly ground cornmeal, the grinding stones neatly stacked, the empty plates that needed washing. Evidence that someone had been here, that she had not been alone, if only for a little while. The rest of the day passed in its usual routine of chores and maintenance. Sarah fed the chickens, watered the garden, mended a tear in one of her dresses, and tried not to think about James Thornton or his kind eyes or the way he had simply helped without making her feel weak for needing it. She did not expect to see him again. The Miller Ranch was a big operation, and cowboys came and went constantly. He would sign on, work his season, and then drift to the next job, the next town, the next horizon. That was the way of things in this country. People moved on. Nothing stayed the same. But 2 days later, as Sarah was drawing water from the well in the early morning coolness, she heard hoofbeats again. She turned, shading her eyes against the rising sun, and felt her heart do an odd little skip when she recognized the chestnut horse and its rider. James Thornton rode into her yard and dismounted with a smile that seemed a bit uncertain. "Morning, Sarah." "Good morning." She set down her water bucket. "Did you get lost again?" "No, I found the Miller Ranch just fine. Signed on as a hand like I planned." He took off his hat and turned it in his hands, a gesture that seemed almost nervous. "Thing is, I could not stop thinking about what we talked about you being out here alone. And I have got a proposition for you if you're willing to hear it." Sarah felt her guard go up immediately. "What kind of proposition?" "Nothing improper," James said quickly, as if reading her suspicion. "Just a business arrangement. The Miller Ranch is a good operation, but they have only got work through the fall roundup. After that, they will be cutting their crew down for winter, and I will be out of a job anyway. So I was thinking, what if I worked here for you? Help you get this place properly running, repairs, planting, whatever needs doing. In exchange, you provide room and board, and maybe a small share of any profits if we can get a crop in or raise some stock to sell. Sarah stared at him. You want to work here? Why? Because you need the help, and I need work that will last beyond a few months, James said simply. And because I liked it here. It is quiet, peaceful. After years of drifting from ranch to ranch, sleeping in bunkhouses with a dozen other men, the idea of putting down roots somewhere sounds appealing. You would be living here, Sarah pointed out, on my property. People will talk. People always talk, but if it concerns you, I can sleep in the barn. Or we could build a separate cabin for me. I'm a decent carpenter. James stepped closer, his expression earnest. Look, I know this is sudden. We barely know each other. But I have got a good feeling about this, Sarah. I think we could help each other. You need an extra pair of hands, and I need a place to belong. It seems like it could work out well for both of us. Sarah wanted to say no, wanted to protect her independence, her solitude, her carefully maintained illusion that she could handle everything herself. But the truth was, she could not handle everything herself. She was exhausted, overwhelmed, and slowly losing ground despite her best efforts. And James seemed genuine in his offer, not looking for charity or taking advantage, but proposing a fair exchange of labor for sustenance. I cannot pay you wages, she warned. Not until we actually make some money from this place, and that could take a year or more. I understand that. I have got a little money saved from previous jobs, enough to get by. And you would really be willing to sleep in the barn? I have slept in worse places, believe me. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling as if she stood on the edge of a cliff. All right, she said, we can try it. But this is a trial arrangement. If it does not work out for either of us, we part ways with no hard feelings. Agreed? James's face broke into a wide smile. Agreed. You will not regret this, Sarah. I promise to work hard and earn my keep. I am going to hold you to that. But Sarah found herself smiling too, feeling a flutter of something that might have been hope. Maybe things were about to change. Maybe she did not have to be alone anymore. James rode back to the Miller Ranch to collect his few belongings and explain the situation to his foreman, promising to return before sunset. Sarah spent the rest of the day in a strange state of nervous energy, cleaning the house more thoroughly than necessary, checking the barn to see what condition it was in for sleeping quarters, and wondering if she had just made a huge mistake or the best decision of her life. When James returned in the late afternoon, he had a bedroll, a battered canvas bag that seemed to contain all his worldly possessions, and the same easy smile that made Sarah feel slightly less anxious about this entire arrangement. He surveyed the barn with a practical eye and declared it perfectly suitable after a bit of cleaning, which they tackled together before the light failed. That night, Sarah lay in her own bed staring at the dark ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving around outside. It felt strange knowing that James was out there in the barn, strange but not frightening. Almost comforting, actually, to know that she was not completely alone under the vast desert sky. The next morning began their new routine. James woke with the dawn, just as Sarah did, and they met in the yard to discuss the day's priorities over cups of bitter coffee. There was so much to do that it was hard to know where to start, but James approached it methodically, suggesting they focus first on the most urgent repairs and then move on to projects that would improve their long-term prospects. They mended the fence around the chicken coop where coyotes had been testing for weaknesses. They patched the roof of the barn where winter rains had caused leaks. They cleared brush from around the well to make it easier to access. They worked side by side in the garden, weeding and watering and coaxing life from the stubborn earth. James proved to be exactly what he had promised, a tireless worker who knew his way around a homestead and never complained about the hard labor or simple living conditions. But more than that, he was easy company. He had a gentle sense of humor that could make Sarah laugh even when she was exhausted and frustrated. He told stories of his years drifting across Texas and New Mexico, working ranches and meeting characters of every description. He asked about her life too, genuinely interested in hearing about her childhood in Missouri and the journey west with her father. Slowly, over days that turned into weeks, Sarah felt herself relaxing around James. The awkwardness of having a stranger on her property faded, replaced by the comfortable rhythm of shared work and shared meals. She stopped thinking of him as hired help and started thinking of him as a partner, someone who cared about the success of the homestead as much as she did because his future was now tied to it too. One evening, about 3 weeks after James had arrived, they sat outside after supper, enjoying the relative coolness as the sun set in spectacular shades of orange and red. Sarah had brought out 2 cups of the coffee that they rationed carefully, and they sipped in companionable silence, watching the colors change across the desert sky. "You know what I have been thinking?" James said eventually. "What is that?" "We should get some cattle, nothing fancy, just a few head to start. We could graze them on that open land to the north, and if we can keep them alive and breeding, we could sell calves in a year or 2. Sarah had thought about this herself, but had dismissed it as impossible. Cattle are expensive. We cannot afford to buy breeding stock. "What if we bought 1 or 2 older cows that are already pregnant, not prime stock, the kind that bigger ranches sell off because they do not want to bother with them? They go cheap. And if we are lucky, those cows will give us calves, and then we can start building a herd." "That is still money we do not have." James was quiet for a moment. "I have got about $40 saved," he said finally. "That should be enough for 2 pregnant cows if we are not particular about quality. I know it is a risk, Sarah. The cattle could die, the calves could die, we could lose everything. But if we do not take some risks, we will never get ahead of just surviving." Sarah turned to look at him. This man who had appeared in her life barely a month ago and was now proposing to invest his life savings into her failing homestead. "Why would you do that? Risk your own money on this place?" "Because I believe in it," James said simply. "I believe we can make this work. And because I am invested now, not just in the land, but in—" He trailed off, and even in the fading light, Sarah could see a faint flush creeping up his neck. "In what?" she prompted softly. "In you," James finished, meeting her eyes. "I am invested in you, Sarah, in your success, your happiness. I want to see you thrive, not just survive." Something warm and fluttery awakened in Sarah's chest, something she had not felt in so long that it took her a moment to recognize it as attraction, as the first stirring of deeper feelings. She had been so focused on survival, on grief, on simply making it through each day that she had not noticed when friendship had started to shade into something more. But looking at James now, at his honest face and kind eyes and the hopeful way he was watching her, she realized that somewhere in the past 3 weeks she had stopped seeing him as just a helpful stranger and started seeing him as a man, a good, decent man who made her laugh and worked alongside her without complaint and apparently believed in her more than she believed in herself. "All right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now let us buy some cattle." James's face broke into a brilliant smile. "You mean it?" "I do. If you are willing to risk your money, the least I can do is trust your judgment. You will not regret this, Sarah, I promise." They rode to Tucson the following week, making the long journey on horseback in the early morning hours to avoid the worst of the day's heat. The town was a chaotic mix of adobe buildings, dusty streets, and people from every walk of life. Mexican families who had been there for generations, Apache scouts working for the army, white settlers like themselves, Chinese railroad workers, and every variety of cowboy, miner, merchant, and miscellaneous drifter that the West attracted. Sarah did not come to town often, finding the noise and crowds overwhelming after the quiet solitude of her homestead, but with James beside her, navigating the busy streets felt less daunting. They made their way to the stockyards on the edge of town, where a cattle auction was in progress. James proved to be a shrewd negotiator, inspecting potential purchases with a critical eye and refusing to be pressured by fast-talking sellers. They ended up with 2 older cows, both pregnant and both looking a bit worse for wear. But James assured Sarah that they had good bones and would produce strong calves. The purchase took most of James's savings, plus a bit of the emergency money Sarah had been hoarding. They drove the cattle back toward the homestead slowly, letting the animals set the pace. It took 2 days of careful traveling, camping overnight in the open desert, but they got both cows home without incident. That night, as they stood by the makeshift corral James had built, watching their new cattle settle in, Sarah felt something shift inside her. This was not just her homestead anymore, it was theirs. She and James were building something together, taking risks together, investing in a shared future. When she said as much, James turned to her with an expression that was equal parts tender and intense. "I am glad you feel that way," he said, "because I cannot imagine being anywhere else, or working with anyone else. You have become very important to me, Sarah." "You have become important to me too," Sarah admitted, her heart racing. James reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to step back if she wanted. When she did not move, he took her hand gently in his. His palm was calloused from work, warm and solid and real. "I do not want to rush anything," he said carefully. "I know we have only known each other a short time, but I want you to know that my feelings for you go beyond business partnership or friendship. I think about you all the time. I wake up looking forward to seeing your face. Working beside you is the best part of my day." Sarah squeezed his hand, feeling tears prick her eyes. "I feel the same way," she confessed. "I did not expect this, did not plan for it. But you have brought light back into my life, James. Hope. Things I thought I had lost when my father died." "You brought those things into my life too," James said. "I have been drifting for so long, never feeling like I belonged anywhere. But here with you, I feel like I have finally found home." They stood there in the gathering darkness, hands clasped, hearts opening, the future spreading before them like the vast, starlit sky overhead. Sarah felt the last of her defensive walls crumbling, felt herself falling into this thing between them with a mixture of joy and terror. "Can I kiss you?" James asked softly. "Yes," Sarah breathed. He leaned in slowly, and when his lips met hers, it was gentle and sweet and perfect. Sarah felt warmth flood through her, felt something long frozen inside her begin to thaw. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," James admitted. "I wish you had done it sooner," Sarah said, making him laugh. They walked back to the house hand in hand, and when they reached the point where they usually parted ways, James for the barn and Sarah for the house, they lingered, reluctant to separate even for the night. "I do not want to compromise your reputation," James said, "but I also do not want to leave you." "Maybe you do not have to," Sarah said, feeling bold. "Maybe it is time we stopped worrying so much about what people might think and started focusing on what will make us happy." James looked at her searchingly. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I trust you, that I care for you, that I want you in my life, not just as a business partner, but as something more." Sarah took a deep breath. "I am saying that maybe we should consider making this arrangement more permanent." "Like marriage?" James asked, and his voice held wonder. "Like marriage," Sarah confirmed, "if that is something you would want." "Sarah Mitchell, that is the only thing I want." James pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I would be honored to be your husband, to build a life with you, to make this homestead into a real home." They were married 3 weeks later in Tucson, in a simple ceremony at the small church with 2 strangers pulled off the street as witnesses. Sarah wore the best dress she owned, which was not much, and James bought a new shirt for the occasion with the last of his money. The preacher seemed slightly skeptical about the hasty marriage, but performed the ceremony without comment, and when James kissed his bride, Sarah felt her whole world shift and settle into a new, better configuration. They rode back to their homestead as husband and wife, and that night James moved his belongings from the barn into the house, into Sarah's bedroom, into her life completely and thoroughly. They made love with gentle passion, learning each other's bodies, sealing their commitment with physical intimacy that felt both sacred and joyful. In the months that followed, Sarah discovered what it meant to truly share a life with someone. It was not always easy. They had disagreements about how to allocate their limited resources, about whether to focus on expanding the garden or improving the irrigation system, about 100 small decisions that homesteading required, but they learned to talk through their differences, to compromise, to respect each other's opinions even when they disagreed. The cattle thrived under James's careful attention. Both cows gave birth to healthy calves in the spring of 1884, and suddenly they had the beginning of a real herd. James traded work with a neighboring rancher in exchange for a young bull, ensuring they could continue breeding. The vegetable garden flourished with the extra labor to maintain it properly. They added more chickens and started selling eggs in town. Slowly, incrementally, the homestead began to not just survive but actually prosper. They were not rich by any measure, but they had enough to eat, enough to meet their needs, and even a little left over to save for emergencies or investments. More than the material improvements, though, Sarah treasured the emotional richness that James had brought into her life. They talked for hours in the evenings, sharing their thoughts and dreams and fears. They laughed together over small absurdities and supported each other through difficulties. They celebrated tiny victories like a particularly good batch of bread or a fence repair completed ahead of schedule. James proved to be an attentive, affectionate husband who never took Sarah for granted. He left her little gifts of wildflowers picked from the desert. He rubbed her sore shoulders after long days of work. He told her she was beautiful even when she was covered in dust and sweat. He made her feel cherished in a way she had never experienced before, and Sarah discovered that she had depths of love and tenderness that she had not known existed. She found herself watching James work and feeling overwhelmed with affection for this good man who had chosen her. She learned to show her feelings through touch and words, overcoming the stoic reserve her father had modeled. She opened her heart fully, trusting James with all the vulnerable parts of herself. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, James said, "I have been thinking about the future." "What about it?" Sarah asked, leaning against his shoulder. "About expanding. Not just the homestead, but our family." He took her hand. "I would like us to have children, if that's something you want. I think you would be a wonderful mother." Sarah felt a rush of warmth at the thought. "I would like that too," she admitted. "I always imagined having children someday, but after my father died, I thought that dream was over, that I would live alone out here, and that would be the end of it." "Well, you're not alone anymore," James said firmly. "And whatever future we build it together." "Together," Sarah echoed, turning the word over in her mind and finding she liked the sound of it immensely. By October of 1884, Sarah realized she was pregnant. The morning sickness started first, then the exhaustion, and finally the undeniable changes in her body that confirmed what she suspected. When she told James, he lifted her off her feet and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. "We are going to be parents," he said wonderingly. "Sarah, we are going to have a baby." "We are," Sarah confirmed, laughing and dizzy and happier than she could remember being. James became even more attentive during her pregnancy, insisting she rest when she was tired, taking on the heavier chores, and generally fussing over her in ways that Sarah found both annoying and endearing. But she appreciated his care, especially as the pregnancy progressed and simple tasks became more difficult. They spent the winter preparing for the baby's arrival, converting a corner of their bedroom into a nursery of sorts. James built a beautiful cradle from wood he had carefully seasoned, sanding it smooth and rubbing it with oil until it gleamed. Sarah sewed tiny clothes from fabric she bought in town, marveling at how small the garments were. The neighboring families, once distant, became more involved as word spread about the coming baby. Women Sarah barely knew appeared with gifts and advice. The Johnson family, their nearest neighbors, promised to send their eldest daughter to help when Sarah's time came. In May of 1885, after a long and difficult labor, Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Thomas, after Sarah's father. And when James held his son for the first time, there were tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," James whispered, staring at the tiny, red-faced infant in awe. "Sarah, you did such an amazing job. He is absolutely perfect." Sarah, exhausted but euphoric, watched her husband cradle their child and felt her heart expand to accommodate this new, overwhelming love. She had thought she understood love before, had believed her feelings for James were the deepest emotion she could experience. But the love she felt for this tiny person, this helpless baby who depended on them for everything, was something entirely different and equally powerful. The first months of parenthood were exhausting and chaotic. Thomas was a colicky baby who cried frequently and slept poorly. Sarah spent countless nights walking the floor with him, singing soft lullabies, trying everything she could think of to soothe him. James helped as much as he could, taking turns with the nighttime duty, even though he had to be up at dawn for the livestock. But even in the midst of the exhaustion, there was profound joy. Thomas's first smile, his first laugh, the way he started to recognize his parents and reach for them, these tiny milestones felt like miracles. Sarah and James marveled over every development, every change, every new thing their son learned. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the homestead continued to grow too. They expanded their cattle herd carefully, reinvesting their small profits into more livestock. They added a second room onto the house, giving Thomas his own small bedroom. They planted fruit trees that would take years to mature but represented investment in a long-term future. Other families in the area began to look to James for advice about animal husbandry, and he earned extra money helping neighbors with difficult calvings or sick livestock. Sarah started selling her baked goods in town, discovering she had a talent for bread making that people were willing to pay for. Between them, they built a life that was modest but secure, marked by steady progress rather than dramatic wealth. When Thomas was 2 years old, Sarah became pregnant again. This second pregnancy was easier than the first, and in the spring of 1888 she gave birth to a daughter they named Clara, after James's mother. Clara was a calmer baby than Thomas had been, quick to smile and easy to comfort. Thomas, now old enough to understand he had a sister, was fascinated by the tiny infant and wanted to help with everything. The house felt full in a way Sarah had never imagined during those lonely months after her father's death. There was always noise now, always someone needing something, always the beautiful chaos of family life. She and James had to work harder than ever to find time alone together, but they managed. Stealing moments in the early morning before the children woke or in the evening after they were asleep. Their love had deepened and matured along with their lives. It was no longer the exciting new feeling of those early months, but something richer and more solid. They knew each other completely now, the good and the bad, the strengths and the flaws. They had weathered difficulties together, illnesses, droughts, financial worries, sleepless nights, and personal frustrations. And through it all, they had chosen each other repeatedly, recommitting to their partnership every day. One evening when Thomas was 6 and Clara was 4, the family sat together on their porch watching the sunset. It had become a cherished ritual, this quiet time at the end of the day when they gathered to appreciate the beauty of the desert sky and each other's company. Thomas was telling a rambling story about something he had seen in town that day, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement. Clara sat in Sarah's lap, sucking her thumb and fighting sleep. James had his arm around Sarah's shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling deeply content. "Are you happy?" James asked softly, for her ears alone. Sarah looked around at her family, at her home, at the land they had worked so hard to tame and make productive. She thought about the frightened, exhausted, lonely woman she had been that day when James first rode into her yard and saw her struggling with the corn grinding. She thought about how far they had come, how much they had built together. "I am more than happy," she said. "I am blessed." "So am I," James said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Every single day, I thank God for getting lost on that road and ending up at your homestead. Best wrong turn I ever took." "It was not a wrong turn," Sarah said with a smile. "It was fate." I think you might be right about that. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the deepening blue sky, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost so much when her father died, had felt like her life was over before it had truly begun. But from that loss had come new beginning, unexpected love, and a future richer than anything she could have planned. The years continued to pass, marked by the steady rhythms of homestead life and the milestones of a growing family. Thomas grew into a serious, responsible boy who loved working with his father and the animals. Clara was more spirited, quick-witted, and independent, often getting into mischief but charming her way out of trouble. In 1891, when Thomas was 8 and Clara was 6, Sarah gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named William and Benjamin. The sudden jump from 2 children to 4 was overwhelming at first, but the family adapted. Thomas and Clara rose to the challenge of being older siblings, helping with the babies, and taking on more responsibilities around the homestead. The double blessing of the twins also brought double challenges. Money was tighter with 4 mouths to feed. Space was limited in the house. Sarah and James were perpetually exhausted, running on coffee and determination, but they faced it together, as they faced everything, and somehow they made it work. By the mid-1890s, the homestead had become a genuinely successful operation. They had a substantial cattle herd that provided reliable income. Sarah's bread business had expanded to include other baked goods that were popular in Tucson. They had finally saved enough money to drill a proper well with a windmill, making water access much easier. The fruit trees James had planted years earlier were now producing abundant crops. More importantly, they had become pillars of their small community. Their homestead was no longer isolated, but part of a network of families who helped each other, traded goods and labor, celebrated together, and mourned together. Sarah and James hosted gatherings, attended church services in town, and built friendships that enriched their lives. Their children thrived in this environment. They attended the small school that had been established in Tucson, riding in together with other ranch children once they were old enough. They learned to work hard, but also to find joy in simple pleasures. They grew up understanding the value of family, the importance of helping others, and the satisfaction of building something with your own hands. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1894, James surprised Sarah with a gift he had been secretly working on for months. He had built an addition to their house, a proper separate bedroom for them larger than the cramped space they had been sharing, with real glass windows and a beautiful wooden floor he had planed and polished himself. "You have given me so much," James said as he showed her the finished room. "A home, a family, a purpose. I wanted to give you something that was just for us. A space where we can be not just parents and homesteaders, but husband and wife." Sarah, overwhelmed with emotion, threw her arms around him. "It is beautiful. You are beautiful. I love you so much, James Thornton." "I love you too, Sarah Thornton. More today than yesterday, and more tomorrow than today." They stood together in their new room, holding each other, and Sarah marveled at how the word home had changed meaning over the years. It was not just the physical structure anymore, not just the land they worked. Home was this man, these children, the life they had created together from nothing but determination and love. The turn of the century brought changes to the Arizona territory. More settlers arrived, establishing towns and bringing civilization's comforts and complications. The railroad expanded, making travel easier and opening new markets for their cattle and produce. The Apache wars that had once made the territory dangerous were long over, and relative peace prevailed. Thomas, now a young man of 17, had developed into a skilled rancher who could handle almost any aspect of the operation. He talked about starting his own homestead someday, but Sarah could tell he was reluctant to leave the family operation. She and James discussed offering him a partnership, bringing him into the business as a full partner rather than just hired help. Clara, at 15, had inherited her mother's business sense and her father's charm. She had taken over the baking operation almost entirely, expanding it further, and even hiring a girl from town to help with deliveries. She talked about someday opening a proper bakery in Tucson, dreams that Sarah encouraged even as she hoped her daughter would not go too far away. The twins, now 11, were inseparable and constantly competing with each other. William was studious, always reading when he should be doing chores. Benjamin was physical, happiest when working with the cattle or horses. They balanced each other perfectly and kept the household lively with their debates and contests. In the spring of 1902, Sarah realized with some surprise that she was pregnant again. At 41 years old, she had assumed her childbearing days were over. When she told James, he was briefly concerned. Older pregnancies carried more risks. But then he broke into a wide smile. "Another adventure," he said. "After 4 children, you would think we would know what we are doing by now." "One would think," Sarah agreed with a laugh. This late pregnancy was harder on Sarah's body than the previous ones had been. She tired more easily and dealt with aches and pains that had not troubled her before, but her experience made the emotional side easier. She did not worry as much, did not panic over every twinge or symptom, trusted her body to know what to do. In November of 1902, Sarah gave birth to their 5th and final child, a daughter they named Rose. She arrived quickly and easily compared to some of her siblings, and from the start she seemed to be a peaceful, contented baby. The older children doted on their baby sister, taking turns holding her and helping care for her. James, now 45, looked at his youngest child with wonder, and perhaps a touch of astonishment that they were doing this again. 5 children, he mused. When I was drifting across Texas all those years ago, I never imagined I would end up with 5 children and a homestead and a wife I love more than life itself. Life has a way of surprising us, Sarah said, watching him cradle tiny Rose with the same gentle care he had shown Thomas nearly 18 years earlier. Usually in good ways, if we are patient enough to wait for them. The early years of the 20th century were good to the Thornton family. The homestead was now properly established, with a large house that had been expanded multiple times, several outbuildings, productive fields, and a cattle herd that numbered in the hundreds. They employed several hands during busy seasons, young cowboys who reminded Sarah of how James had looked when he first rode into her yard. In 1905, Thomas married a girl from a neighboring ranch, a practical, kind young woman named Elizabeth, who fit seamlessly into the family. James made good on his promise to bring Thomas into the business as a partner, and father and son worked side by side managing the operation. Thomas and Elizabeth built a cabin on the far corner of the property, close enough to help, but far enough for independence. Clara, true to her word, opened a bakery in Tucson in 1907. She was 22 years old and fiercely determined to make the business succeed. Sarah helped her get started, contributing recipes and initial capital, and took pride in watching her daughter thrive as an independent businesswoman. Clara met a lawyer in town, a serious young man who clearly adored her, and they married in 1908. The twins, now young men of 18, both decided they wanted to try their hands at different paths before settling down. William enrolled in the teachers' college that had opened in Tucson, planning to become an educator. Benjamin signed on with a cattle drive heading north, wanting to see more of the country before returning to the homestead. Sarah worried about them both, but recognized that they needed to find their own ways. Rose grew into a bright, curious child who loved books and learning. At 5 years old, she was already pestering her older brothers to teach her to read, following William around whenever he was home and asking endless questions. Sarah saw echoes of herself in Rose's determination and independence, mixed with James's easy charm and optimism. On a warm evening in May 1909, Sarah and James celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. Their children organized a party at the homestead, inviting friends and neighbors from across the territory. Tables were laden with food, music played, and people danced in the yard as the sun set in spectacular fashion. Sarah stood a little apart from the festivities for a moment, watching her family and friends celebrate. Thomas was dancing with Elizabeth, who was visibly pregnant with their first child. Clara had arrived from town with her husband, and they were talking animatedly with a group of neighbors. William was home for the weekend and looked happier than Sarah had seen him in months, clearly loving his studies. Even Benjamin had made it back from his cattle drive just in time for the celebration. And Rose was weaving through the crowd, charming everyone she encountered with her precocious observations. James found Sarah and slipped an arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how lucky we are," Sarah said simply. "About how different my life might have been if you had not gotten lost that day and ended up at my homestead." "I think about that sometimes too," James admitted. "About all the small choices and chances that led to us finding each other. It seems like a miracle when you think about it." "It was a miracle," Sarah agreed. She turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. 25 years. "We have been married for 25 years, James. We have raised 5 children. We have built this homestead into something substantial. We have created a life that I would not trade for anything in the world." "Neither would I." James lifted her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "You are still the most beautiful woman I have ever seen. Still the strongest, bravest person I know. I fall in love with you more deeply every single day." "And I love you more than words can express, Sarah said, feeling tears prick her eyes. "You saved me, James. When I was grinding that corn and my arms were shaking and I could barely go on, you appeared like an answer to a prayer I had not even voiced. You made me rest. You took care of me. And you never stopped taking care of me." "We take care of each other," James corrected gently. "That is what a marriage is supposed to be. 2 people choosing each other. Every day. Through whatever comes." They kissed then. A sweet, tender kiss that held 25 years of love and partnership and shared history. When they pulled apart, Sarah saw tears on James's face too, matching her own. "Come on," she said, tugging his hand. "Let us go dance with our children and celebrate this beautiful life we have built." They rejoined the party, dancing together as the stars came out and their family and friends celebrated around them. Sarah rested her head on James's shoulder as they swayed to the music, and she thought about that exhausted, lonely woman she had been all those years ago, grinding corn with trembling arms, believing she had to do everything alone. How wrong she had been. How grateful she was to have learned that accepting help was not weakness, but wisdom, that letting someone in did not diminish her strength, but multiplied it. That love was not a distraction from survival, but the very thing that made life worth living. The years continued their steady march. Thomas and Elizabeth had 3 children who ran wild on the homestead, bringing new life and laughter to the property. Sarah became a grandmother and discovered that loving grandchildren was somehow even more pure and uncomplicated than loving her own children had been. She could enjoy them without the constant worry that parenting required, could spoil them and play with them and then hand them back when they needed discipline or routine. Clara's bakery thrived, becoming an institution in Tucson. She and her husband had 2 daughters who helped in the business from a young age, learning their mother's recipes and business sense. Clara visited the homestead regularly, always bringing treats and stories from town. William completed his education and took a teaching position at the school in Tucson. He married a fellow teacher, and they had 1 son who was serious and studious like his father. William talked about eventually becoming a principal or maybe even starting a new school in one of the smaller settlements springing up across Arizona. Benjamin returned from his travels and settled back on the homestead, working alongside Thomas and James. He married a Mexican woman from Tucson, which caused some gossip among narrow-minded neighbors, but which James and Sarah welcomed wholeheartedly. Benjamin and Maria had 4 children who were bilingual and beautiful, bridging cultures with effortless grace. Rose, the baby of the family, grew into a spirited teenager with dreams of becoming a writer. She filled notebooks with observations and stories, capturing life in the Arizona territory with vivid detail. Sarah encouraged her daughter's artistic ambitions, remembering her own youthful dreams and hoping Rose would have opportunities she herself had never had. In 1915, James turned 58 years old. He was still strong and active, but Sarah noticed he tired more easily than he once had. His hair had gone completely gray, and lines marked his face. But to her, he was as handsome as the dusty cowboy who had ridden into her yard over 30 years earlier. They spent more time together now that the homestead largely ran itself, with Thomas and Benjamin handling most of the daily work. They took rides across the property, just the 2 of them, remembering all the changes they had witnessed and made. They sat on the porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sunsets they had watched together thousands of times before, but which never lost their beauty. One evening, as they sat in their usual spot, James said, "I have been thinking about how we met." "You have been doing that a lot lately," Sarah observed with a gentle smile. "I know, I think it is a sign of getting old, spending so much time looking backward instead of forward." James squeezed her hand. "But our story is worth remembering, worth celebrating. You were grinding corn and your arms were shaking, and I helped you. Such a small thing, really. But it changed everything." "It did," Sarah agreed. "If you had just gotten your directions and ridden on, if you had not noticed I needed help or not cared enough to offer it, our lives would have been so different." "I could not have ridden on," James said. "Even if I had tried, I think something would have pulled me back. You were meant to be mine, Sarah, and I was meant to be yours. I believe that with everything in me." "I believe it too," Sarah said softly. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from blue to purple to black, the stars emerging one by one. Sarah thought about the long, winding path that had brought them to this moment, the losses and challenges they had faced, the joys and triumphs they had celebrated, the ordinary, extraordinary miracle of building a life together. In 1920, Arizona finally achieved statehood, having been a territory for far too long. The Thornton family celebrated with their neighbors, proud to be citizens of the 48th state. The homestead that Sarah and James had built from almost nothing was now part of something larger, woven into the fabric of a new state's history. James retired from active ranching in 1922, turning full control over to Thomas and Benjamin. He was 65 years old and had earned his rest, though Sarah knew he would never stop working entirely. He puttered around the property, mending things that did not really need mending, offering advice whether his sons asked for it or not, and spending long hours in the workshop building furniture for his ever-expanding collection of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Sarah, at 61, had slowed down as well. Her hands were arthritic now, making fine handwork difficult. But her mind was sharp, and she spent her time reading, writing letters to her scattered children and grandchildren, and enjoying the fruits of decades of hard work. Rose had published her first book, a collection of stories about life in the Arizona Territory. She had sent a copy to her parents with an inscription that read, "To Mama and Papa, whose love story is the greatest story I know." Sarah kept the book on her bedside table and reread it often, marveling at her daughter's talent and grateful that Rose had chosen to tell their family's story to the world. On a spring morning in 1925, Sarah woke to find James already awake beside her, watching her with an expression of such love that it took her breath away even after 41 years of marriage. "Good morning, beautiful," he said softly. "Good morning yourself, handsome." Sarah reached out to touch his face, her arthritic fingers gentle on his weathered skin. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" "About that day I rode up to this homestead and saw you grinding corn," James said, "about how your arms were trembling and you were so exhausted you could barely stand, about how I took over and made you rest, and how that simple act led to everything we have now. Our whole life came from that moment," Sarah mused. "It did. And I want you to know something, Sarah. Taking care of you that day was not charity or pity. It was not even just kindness, though I hope it was kind. It was recognition. I saw myself in you all those years of struggling alone, pretending I did not need help, trying to be strong enough for everything. And I saw what we could be together, even though I did not fully understand it yet. We saved each other," Sarah said. "You helped me with the corn, but I gave you a place to belong, a home, a family. We were both lost and we found each other." "That is exactly right," James agreed. He pulled her close, and they lay together in the early morning quiet, listening to the sounds of the homestead waking up around them. The years had not always been easy. They had faced drought and disease, financial worries, and family conflicts, the normal trials that any long life accumulates. But they had faced everything together, and that had made all the difference. As the sun rose higher and the day properly began, Sarah and James finally got up. They dressed slowly, joints protesting, and made their way to the kitchen where the smell of coffee brewing told them that someone, probably Thomas's eldest son who was staying with them for the summer, had beaten them to the morning chores. They sat at the old wooden table, the same one James had eaten at on his first day at the homestead, and shared coffee and simple breakfast. Through the window, they could see the sprawling property that had grown from Sarah's small, struggling claim into a thriving, multi-generational family ranch. "Do you have any regrets?" Sarah asked suddenly. James looked at her in surprise. "Regrets? About what?" "About anything. About signing on here instead of taking that job at the Miller Ranch. About marrying a woman you barely knew. About the life we built." James reached across the table and took her hand, his grip still strong despite his age. "Sarah Thornton, I have lived 68 years on this earth, and I can honestly say I regret nothing about the life we have shared. Every choice I made that led me to you was the right choice. Every day we have spent together has been a gift." "Even the hard days?" Sarah pressed. "Especially the hard days," James said firmly. "Those are the days that tested us, that proved our love was strong enough to weather anything. Those are the days that made the good days so much sweeter." Sarah felt tears fill her eyes, but they were happy tears. "I feel the same way. I would not change a single thing." They finished their breakfast and went out to the porch, settling into the rocking chairs that had become their thrones in recent years. From here they could watch the life of the ranch unfold. Cowboys riding out to check on the herd, Thomas giving instructions to the hands, Elizabeth hanging laundry with the help of one of her daughters, children playing in the yard. A young cowboy, probably about the same age James had been when he first arrived, rode past and tipped his hat respectfully to the elderly couple on the porch. Sarah smiled at him, and she saw James watching the young man with a distant, nostalgic expression. "Do you see yourself in him?" Sarah asked. "I do," James admitted. "Full of hope and energy, looking for a place to belong. I hope he finds what I found. Not every drifting cowboy is lucky enough to stumble onto a homestead where a beautiful woman needs help grinding corn." Sarah laughed, the sound bright and young despite her years. "And not every exhausted woman grinding corn is lucky enough to have a kind cowboy stop and help her rest." They rocked in companionable silence, hands clasped between the chairs, watching their legacy unfold before them. This homestead, this family, this life, it was everything Sarah had dreamed of during those dark months after her father died, and so much more than she could have imagined. She thought about the girl she had been at 22, alone and frightened and so tired her arms shook. She thought about the man who had appeared like Providence, offering help without strings, building trust through actions rather than words. She thought about the love that had grown between them, starting as friendship and partnership, deepening into romance and passion, maturing into the profound, abiding connection that defined both their lives. "Thank you," Sarah said softly. "For what?" James asked. "For stopping that day. For helping me, for staying, for loving me, for building this beautiful life with me, for everything." James lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Thank you for letting me stay, for trusting me, for loving me back, for giving me a home and a family and a purpose, for everything." They sat together as the Arizona sun climbed higher in the clear blue sky. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting and true. The homestead hummed with life around them, generations of their love made manifest in children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in buildings and livestock and cultivated land. Sarah Mitchell, who had once been grinding corn with trembling arms, now rested in peace beside her husband, and James Thornton, who had once been a drifting cowboy looking for direction, had found his true north in the woman beside him. Their story had begun with a simple act of kindness, a cowboy helping a struggling woman rest, and had blossomed into a love that would echo through generations. It was a story of the Old West, of hard work and harder times, of people building lives from dust and determination. But most of all, it was a love story. And like all the best love stories, it had a perfect, happy ending. Two people growing old together, surrounded by the family they had created and the love they had nurtured, content in the knowledge that they had found exactly what they needed in each other. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward evening, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, Sarah and James remained on their porch, hands entwined, hearts joined, watching another beautiful day end in the territory they had helped tame and the home they had built together. Their journey had been long and not without challenges, but every step had been worth it to arrive at this moment peaceful, fulfilled, and deeply, enduringly in love. The corn had been ground, the work had been done, and rest had been earned. Together they had created something that would last long after they were gone, a legacy of love, family, and the simple truth that sometimes the best things in life come from the smallest acts of kindness. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah whispered one more time, "Thank you for making me rest that day." James pulled her closer and whispered back, "Thank you for letting me stay." In the gathering darkness of the Arizona evening, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and love well earned, Sarah and James Thornton rocked gently in their chairs, hearts full, knowing that their story, which had begun with trembling arms and an offer of help, had become exactly what it was always meant to be, a testament to the transformative power of love, the importance of accepting help, and the beautiful truth that sometimes the best things in life happen when we are brave enough to let someone else share our burdens. Their homestead stood as a monument to what two people could build together when they combined strength, determination, love, and partnership. And as the last light faded from the sky and the desert settled into its nocturnal rhythms, Sarah and James sat together in the peaceful darkness, grateful for every moment, every choice, every day that had brought them to this perfect, hard-won happiness. The end of their story was not an ending at all, but a continuation in the children they had raised, the land they had cultivated, the love they had shared, and the example they had set for generations to come. They had started with nothing but determination and faith, and they had built everything that mattered. And it had all begun with a simple moment. A woman grinding corn until her arms trembled weakly, and a cowboy who took over and made her rest. From that small act of kindness had grown a love that would endure through all the years of their lives and beyond, into legend and memory, proof that the greatest adventures often begin with the smallest gestures of care.